Hi, everybody. It's Book of Katherine, and we are back for Sermon on the Mount, Part 3, Explained. So, we are on the section about murder. He's going through some of the commandments and expanding on them at the very beginning of his Sermon on the Mount. So, we just went over, he says, you're familiar with the commands of the ancients, do not murder. And he's saying even calling people things can be murderous. So he's going to move on here. He says the simple fact is that words kill. So he's about to tell us how you can use words to do the opposite, how you can fight against killing and fight against murder and things like that. He says, this is how I want you to conduct yourselves in these manners. If you enter your place of worship and about to make an offering, you suddenly remember a grudge a friend has against you, abandon your offering, leave immediately, go to this friend, and make things right. Then and only then come back and work things out with God. Okay, so what he's saying here is, look, your religious rights and all of those things are not as important as acting out peace instead of war. So he's saying, look, if someone has a problem with you, go ahead and confront them. Go ahead and try to make peace with them. And that's kind of not the way we do things. We wait for people to tell us they have a problem with us. But that's when things can really blow up and people can get killed. We see it in gang wars all the time. So think about family relationships, and we kind of wait for someone to tell us that they have a problem with us before we tell them we have a problem with us. That's how honor killings build up over time. Fathers or mothers or sons sit back and they simmer and they simmer and they simmer, and then they just explode. And what the Lord is saying is, go ahead and be proactive. If you think someone has a problem with you, go to them and make peace with them. If you feel like your mother is looking over your shoulder and they've got a problem with you, just be like, is there something that I can help you with, mother? Is there something that you're not happy with me about right now, mother? Or whatever you call your mother. And the same thing goes for international politics, right? It's much better that ambassadors cut things off the cake. If they hear a rumor, they go ahead to the other country and they say, look, we've heard this rumor that you have an issue with something. What can we do? Same thing goes to apply in business relationships. It's much better to talk to your clients or talk to your customers and see what problem they have with you. If there's negative things on social media, or if there's, which is more important, negative things in sales. It's much better to just don't wait until someone comes to you and says there's a problem. Go to them first and see like what you can improve upon. So, and same things goes with in like business relationships and employees. We see it all the time. People quit out of nowhere, and you heard that they might have not been happy, but you didn't go ahead and check on it and see. There's all sorts of ways that this applies, but Jesus was predicted, all the prophecies said that he was going to be a peacemaker. That was one of the signs of the Messiah. And that's why this was such a big speech, even back in Judea at that time, because he was giving them instructions on how to create peace in society, in a society that was always at war. There were riots in Rome. There's so much bloodshed in Rome. I mean, there's temples even that still stand in Judea today, in Palestine and Israel. There are temples to Zeus that still stand today, where if you had a grudge against someone, you just took them to the temple and slaughtered them and threw them down the waterfall and used that as your sacrifice to the gods to get whatever crop you wanted to be successful, to make them pleased. But, you used your sacrifices in a very selfish way. And what he's offering is something very different here. You read the court records back then, and there are murders all over the place. You would be surprised at how many murders just happened, and it didn't go to court or anything like that. You just find people dead in the street, stabbed, or you'd find people in a corner, dead, beaten, and no one knew why. No one would say anything. No one would give any statements or anything like that. And so murders happened a lot more common frequently. And here Jesus is saying, no, make peace with each other. In fact, don't just make peace when someone comes to you with a problem. He's saying, go to them if they have a problem with you. go ahead and make peace with them before you come and talk with me. And he's not saying like put yourself in danger or anything like that. His point here is he's saying that's more important than coming to me and like bowing and kneeling and doing all your rituals. He's like, skip church. Skip church if it means going, or skip mosque or whatever temple you have, skip temple. He's like, skip that and go make peace with the people who are plotting war against you, basically. And at least you'd be surprised that the natural law works in your favor if you start doing that. And I mean, it takes a lot of bravery in the cultures that are very non-confrontational. It took me a lot to learn to be confrontational, which sounds funny, I know now, but that took practice. That's not how I was raised. I was raised in an addictive household, kind of like the alcoholic system. And in alcoholic systems, you're not allowed to express any anger. Like the children are absolutely not allowed to express any anger whatsoever. And so children grow up never even feeling the emotion anger. And if they feel it, they think that it's something wrong. And here you're saying, go and talk to someone who's angry with you. And your entire upbringing has said, don't ever confront them. That could result in catastrophic consequences. And he's saying, no, go ahead and do it. And then the natural law blesses you. Even if they're not willing to make peace with you, there is a natural law. They will not come at you as hard. The natural law blesses you. The angels are more on your side. So this is just something to be like, if you think someone has a problem with you, go ahead and ask them. You can skip a lot of anxiety that way, in all areas of life. So moving on, verse 25. Second paragraph for today. Or say you're out on the street and an old enemy accosts you. Don't lose a minute. Make the first move. Make things right with him. After all, if you leave the first move to him, knowing his track record, you're likely to end up in court, maybe even jail. And if that happens, you won't get out without a stiff fine. And that's because in Israel or Judea, they didn't allow the death penalty. So it was fines and lots of trade. Since it was on King's Road and everything was about trade, fines were very debilitating. That was the worst thing that you could get. Everything was based on merchant services. They owned most of the ports around the world. So that's a big deal, having a business fine, having money taken out of your wallet. They were not very wealthy. The people that Jesus was speaking to wasn't the wealthiest businessmen. It was some called Galilee the ghetto, if that makes sense. So anyway, so he's saying that, look, if someone comes after you, go ahead and be humble and just say, look, man, I'll do this for you. He's saying kind of it may not feel right or feel just, but be like, man, just do it to make peace with them. Just be like, look, you want me to do this? He's saying, if you give them a small fee, even if they didn't charge you, I'm sure all of us have gotten a bill at some point that wasn't an actual bill that we should have gotten. And that can make you very, very angry, especially in today's day and age where very few people have, much money and much bandwidth in their paychecks from week to week, or even there's hourly. Just money is not flowing the way that people make it seems. You know what I mean? Money is quite tight around the world. And so to go ahead and say, oh, I'm going to pay a bill that I didn't actually earn, he's saying, go ahead and maybe offer to just pay that bill because it gets it off your place and it causes peace. And in the long run, it'll be a blessing. And I've had to do that. I've had to do that where, when I was just starting out as a student on my own, there's no family support or anything like that. And I remember there's a dentist's office that sent me a bill for something that hadn't happened, and with the amount for me that was it would hurt so bad. And then I remember the point where a friend recommended to me, just go ahead. Isn't it better? It's causing you all this stress. Isn't it better in the long run to just pay it? Yes, it'll be painful, but wouldn't it just be better? And I hadn't considered that yet because, back then no one was actually, even today, people don't teach what Jesus says. And so I did that. I actually just was like, I'm going to bite the bullet and I'm just going to pay it. I'm just going to, and I never got another letter from them. I didn't go back to them. They lost my business. And that was great. Like, I never had to think about it again. And it hurt a little bit in the present, but long term, I was like, thank goodness, why didn't I do that sooner? So he's saying to do the same thing. Like, you can spare yourself a ton of agony by just going ahead if someone gets you on the street being like, okay, just take it. This doesn't just go for finances. So someone asked once, someone asked once back when it happened, when I did that road trip, and gave a story about the plot hound down in North Carolina, one of the adventures we went on when we went on our road trip and followed the Lord. Someone asked us when we got back, we've had a lot of these questions afterwards, but someone asked us when we got home, and they said, was your life ever in danger? And we were like, oh, yeah. And it's not a fun thing that we like to talk about, but our life definitely was in danger. And I remember when our life was in danger the most, it was, of course, a human. There are definitely dangerous animals, but it was the human that was the scariest and that our life was in the most danger. And you could almost feel the war between angels and demons all around us. And I remember that our reaction and the way that we got out of it, we were trying to follow the Lord, but we didn't have a chance to focus on the Lord. We were focused on the knife that this guy was holding. And I remember that what we ended up doing is just not saying anything, we just nodded and went with everything they were saying, and they kept talking. Not saying that this is a rule of thumb to do, but my point is that we didn't yell at them. We didn't do anything to accost them. We didn't rise the tension. Instead, we kind of withdrew, which into ourselves, and we were just kind of more calm and made ourselves smaller and just kind of backed off and waited until the Lord could just calm them down. And then we just made sure to vacate the area and get away, even though we were supposed to stay there that night. We were like, we're out. And we did some very difficult things, made some very hard decisions. But to us, it was best to just not be right, but to be safe and to make peace. And it worked. It worked. We ended up getting everything that we needed. We ended up getting all of our goals. And the only difference is that I guess you could call it being humble, but sometimes you just have to step down a little bit. I don't know if that's humility, but it's just not an option we're really taught today of how to be safe. Even when we hear about going on a trail and a big animal, they say, make yourself bigger, bang on a pot, make yourself do. We're always told to kind of go hard and go big. And sometimes that's not actually the way to do it. Sometimes to make good, to have peace with the world is to just say, yeah, I'll do it. Go this part because long term it'll be better. Or you trust that the Lord will reward you for it. I hope I'm making sense. But, that's a great way to avoid court and jail. You definitely don't want to go and get yourself and have the government up in your lives. Okay, I guess a good example of this today would be divorce, wouldn't it? And we hear so many terrible cases about divorce. It can be that's definitely where it can be the least peaceful part of your life. One guy actually said it could be like getting cancer, as expensive as getting cancer, and even worse to experience, because at least cancer, everyone loves you and gets support. And he was like, no, it can cost you the minimum $250,000. It can be hell, and it'll last you for 10 years, and you don't actually leave each other's life if you have kids. There's no such thing as divorce when you have kids. So this is a perfect example of, okay, it can be a nasty divorce when someone has a grudge against you, your partner has a grudge against you. And honestly, sometimes it's just best, they say this all the time, it's best for the kids if you just make peace with them, if you just go out of your way and you go ahead and make peace with them, because the future, what Jesus is saying, is that it'll get much, much worse. If you rile them up, it's better to just take the hit, take the L, take the loss, and you have to think long term. Jesus is saying long term, taking the L today can benefit you greatly long term. And that lesson goes for so many different areas of life. I can't even begin to tell you. All right, so moving on to adultery and divorce. So, verse 27, Jesus says, you know the next commandment pretty well too. Don't go to bed with another spouse. As if it says, that's such a nice way of putting it. I love the Message translation. Don't go to bed with another man's spouse. But this is super important. I can't even begin to tell you, because when it says don't commit adultery, don't sleep with another man's spouse, this kind of changes it. They say a lot of other things. People rarely go into the actual commandments, but that's the commandment. It says, don't go to bed with another person's spouse. So he's saying, don't screw someone who's married. So all those women who sleep with married men, who say they prefer married men, all people who are prostitutes, as much as Jesus allowed a prostitute and had her walk with him, and prostitutes have their own baggage, but today prostitution is sold as like some empowerment thing. I can't tell you how many women in Hollywood I know that think that being a prostitute is empowering. But the bottom line is that the natural law goes against you. It goes against you if you sleep with somebody's spouse, man or woman. So he's saying, but don't think you've preserved your virtue, continuing on, but don't think you've preserved your virtue simply by staying out of bed. Your heart can be corrupted by lust even quicker than your body. Those ogling looks you think nobody notices, they also corrupt. Well, this is kind of easy I think everybody understands that pornography it doesn't go well for you. Like the natural law is not pro pornography. It's not pro addiction at all. So the Lord saves people from addiction constantly. He gives them their lives back. So I want to really emphasize that in this culture, if you were married and you wanted to sleep with someone else that was not your wife, then you just married them as well and added them to your family. That's just it. And if you think about it, that can prevent quite a bit. It can prevent quite a bit. It can prevent so much. So, but that's a whole other subject. So just understand that in this culture, that's the way people, Abraham was blessed and he had like 7 different wives. Like there's so many women that he had children with, so many different tribes. You should look up his bloodline sometimes. They show just a few to show the 12 tribes of Judah, but, of Jacob. But if you look up his entire bloodline, holy Moses, he has a ton of different families by different women. So, and he's deeply favored by the Father. So that we can't just suddenly twist things and say, this is the way things are today. And actually, that's going to come up later on. So let's keep going. So he's saying, don't think you've preserved your virtue simply by staying out of bed. Your heart can be corrupted by lust even quicker than your body. So I'm going to just keep on going on because what I'm going to say is going to apply to this next part. He says, let's not pretend this is easier than it really is. If you want to live a morally pure life, here's what you have to do. You have to blind your right eye the moment you catch it in a lustful ear. You have to choose to live one-eyed or else be dumped on a moral trash pile. And you have to cut off your right hand the moment you raise it threateningly. Better a bloody stump than your entire being discarded for good in the dump. So I am sure I had a ton of requests, like the floodgate of requests to keep going after part 2. And I am sure that's because people moved on and read into this next part. And they're like, what do you mean? Cut off our hands and, maul out our eyes? Is that actually what he means? And no, look at what the first sentence is. Let's not pretend this is easier than it really is. To live a morally pure life, here's what you have to do. He's saying it's hard. It's hard. Do you think that it was easy? A morally pure life is one that follows God, walks and talks follows with God. Like Abraham was willing to give up his son. Do you think that was easy? He didn't know the Lord was going to say, okay, stay your hand. The Lord was like, I want you to go kill your firstborn son. The one that he had promised, the one that Abraham couldn't wait to have, the one that Sarah was like, I'm almost 100 years old. How can I actually have a child? And then she gets pregnant. And back, in those cultures, even today, having a firstborn and having a son is everything. It's how you continue your bloodline, but also how you have any respect. If you don't, even go ahead and start looking at pictures of children, the firstborn children, compared to the rest of the family. That would be interesting. Go ahead and make some observations. We don't really do it all that much today in cultures that don't value the firstborn. But go ahead and start looking and comparing photos of the firstborn compared to the rest of the family. That's very, very interesting. So, my point is that Abraham finally had a son, and then the Lord's like, I want you to sacrifice him on an altar to me. And Abraham didn't blink an eye. He just did it. He trusted the Lord that much. You have to remember that Abraham's life overlapped with Noah's. So he'd spoken to Noah, and that's the first place the Lord had him travel to. Abraham was just Abram in the beginning, and he lived down in Babylon. And when he decided to follow God, the first place the Lord took him was up to where Noah and the ark had parked itself on the mountain. That's where Noah still lived. And their lives overlapped for like 100 years, I think. So Abraham had a very clear idea of how evil men could be and how bad things could get. And so he actually was like, okay, I will kill my son for you. Now, I haven't met anyone willing to do that. I mean, have you? Have you met anyone who's like, oh, the Lord asked me to kill my son? Or that if the Lord asked them to kill their son or their daughter or their firstborn or any of their children, do you know anyone that would just be like, yes? Or are they going to tell you that must be the mouth of Satan? That must be Satan saying it. I'm not saying the Lord is saying to kill anyone. The whole point of Abraham was to mirror what was going to happen, that the Lord actually did kill his son. He did kill Jesus, for us to sort of understand. It was a precursor to highlight what the Lord was about to do. It's a mirroring event, and the Lord does a lot of those. So, but my point is that Jesus is saying you want to live a morally pure life. It's going to be harder than you think it is. He talks about blinding your right eye. He doesn't even talk about killing your kid, But he's saying, like, living a morally, like, following the Father is not easy in this world. And I can tell you right now, I just did a video talking about when I did a short on YouTube talking about when my husband and I were called by the Father to move to the East Coast. Not a one person in California supported us. Not one. Of course, we got here and then they all wanted to move. They're like, clean skies. You have clean skies? Oh, clean water. You have clean water? You can drink the actual water that comes out of your faucet? They never heard of such a thing. I remember there's faucets. You go to drinking fountains in LA, and it smells like sewage. It smells like something you put in the toilet. Like, it's very hard to drink the water. It's almost impossible. And so you have to buy all of your water. You can't just drink the water. All you can do is maybe shower in it, but people are investing in filters and everything over there. So we ended up being blessed by following the Father. But to actually do it, that was very, 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 very difficult. That was very difficult to do. It's very difficult to, go all around the nation and say that the reason we're doing it, when people asked, is that we're following the Father, if he said to tell them. Do you think people took that well? I mean, churches today do not teach that you can actually talk to the Father, even though they're like, oh, believe in the Bible, believe in the Bible. And all throughout the Old Testament, the Lord talks directly. He talks directly with the saints and with everyone. He sends angels to them. He does all these things. That's not even including everything that's in the Vatican Library and the Jewish Library. There's like tons more text. And that's the whole point of the Messiah, is he sent his Holy Spirit to walk and talk. Even Jesus says it. You'll know someone that's in the Spirit because you don't know when they're coming or when they're going. And you're supposed to follow Jesus. He said that in Matthew 23. Don't put anyone above yourself. No priest, no pastor, no imam, no Buddhist monk, nothing. No one is supposed to speak for God in your life. And that's like there's untold numbers that are on social media telling you, like, over and over, being like, well, we are at this point, all these different things. And it's different it's fascinating to me when I see them do it, because the scripture doesn't back them up. Like, very, very few of them actually talk about what scripture says, and then when they do, they mention Paul. Like, you need to really watch for that. Like, you really, really need to watch for that. It's crazy. And anyway, that's a whole different subject. So my point is that Jesus is saying that it's hard. It's not easy. Just filming this wasn't easy. Like, I've been trying for a week to film this. It has been nearly impossible to film it, and I am so grateful that I'm this far. But I'm like, I really hope I'll get through it, because it's been stopped so many times. But it's even harder. Like, think about trying to live the kind of life that's sexually pure. He's right. You know, if you look at a woman and you leer at a woman, that's also corrupt. And I think the biggest lesson of this is that, hey, like, none of us can actually meet that standard. He's telling everybody, you know, this is how bad it is when you think about this or you think about that. When someone's married and you do this, he's like, that's how corrupt it is. It's still corrupt. It's not just if you're not super pious if you just follow these 10 rules. He's like, no, being morally pure, being pure requires so much more. And that's the whole thing. He's laying a foundation for nobody's pure. You need to be saved. You need to have a Messiah, right? So, moving on. Verse 31. Jesus says, remember the scripture that says, whoever divorces his wife, let him do it legally, giving her divorce papers and her legal rights. Too many of you are using that as a cover for selfishness and whim, pretending to be righteous just because you're legal. Please, no more pretending. If you divorce your wife, you're responsible for making her an adulteress, unless she's already made herself that by her sexual promiscuity. And if you marry such a divorced adulteress, you're automatically an adulterer yourself. You can't use legal cover to mask a moral failure. Okay, so I think that this is a giant point and a giant lesson that even it took me so long to learn this one. And that's because so many of us take laws, the laws of earth, the laws of humans, and we mistake them to be the natural laws of the universe. So, perfect example, let's say the Bill of Rights in the United States in the Constitution. We say these are God-given rights, they're inalienable rights, we have the right to free speech. And people talk about it as if it's scripture. I've made that mistake, you know, not a ton, but I have definitely been like, well, you know, there was a time where I almost referred to the Constitution as a piece of scripture, because I thought these were laws that came from the Father. And that's not, I mean, yes, obviously at the bottom it says that, you know, if these are true, let the Lord back us up and let him defend us. But by the time it came to the end, when all the war after that's the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution was different. That's the Declaration of Independence was backed by God. The Constitution is something entirely different. And there's no sign, the way you look at the government, it doesn't appear that a president was something that the Father was building, was having a president. So we treat the president like a king. We're breaking Matthew 23 when we have a president. So that's, I suppose it's another subject, but my point is saying that we think that if we obey the law, that we're good citizens, that we're pure, we're law-abiding citizens. And he's saying, no, no, no. And that is why it took me so long to figure this out, you guys. When bad things happen in the United States, and maybe even in your own country, and you're like, but we follow all these laws. The moms give us all these laws, and we're holy and we're righteous. Why are these bad things happening? Why is this flood coming? Why are our monetary things happening? How are we losing all this money? How is fraud happening? How are we going to war? How is this and this and all these bad things are happening? Why are we losing our rights? And I finally understood why we were losing all of these rights all over the world and all of these treatments by our governments. Because we were paying attention to what the law said and being law-abiding citizens by human law, but we were not paying attention to God's law, against the 10 Commandments and against what Jesus is teaching here. We were screwing up all over the place. So when a community suddenly has something bad happen to them, they blame it on their administrators. And I'm like, well, scripture actually says, like, the apostles actually say, listen to your government. Your government is a gift from God to protect you. Think about it. If we don't have our government, the blackout of New York is a perfect example. Every time there's a blackout and the government is made immobile, people loot and they riot. That's what we would be without government. That's what we would be without government. That's who we really are. That's who we really are. When you go on the internet and you see everything that's there, that's who we really are. And so we're facing judgment and condemnation, not based on how we, adhere to certain regulations that our governors give us or that our presidents or dictators give us. That doesn't make us holy. If you're like, I hear all the time, don't you? Like saying like, he's been an upstanding citizen. What does that mean? That doesn't mean that they're going to make it into heaven. That means doesn't say anything about their character. There are tons of criminals and evil people who are upstanding citizens because they obey the law. And that's what Jesus is saying. He's like, don't go throwing that at me of like, you divorced a woman. You just, because you did it legally, you're a good guy. And the backup I can definitely expand on this when it comes to divorce, because he's definitely bringing up divorce. And I've noticed that Satan really uses marriage and sex and relationships to just come at us. He really attacks it. I feel like it's a focal point of his corruption. What he does is, especially in the West, he says, okay, be promiscuous, have sex at a young age, do all these different things. And then he says, now get married. And if they cheat at all, then divorce them. Then they're an evil person. And I'm like, well, you can't be like trading off 500 partners here and then suddenly get married. And then suddenly you're pure and virginal and you never have a wandering eye. It sets you up for just suffering and destruction and a misery for your entire life. So what Jesus is saying here is he's not, my point is that the Lord and his position on marriage and cheating goes all the way back to the book of Hosea. If you read about the prophet Hosea in ancient Israel, the Lord shows you what he thinks about cheating and divorce and what he actually does. And I would encourage you, if you're thinking about divorce, I would encourage you to read Hosea and see how the Lord deals with divorce. If the Lord doesn't lead, we cheat on the Lord all the time, and he still doesn't leave us. He brings up the sun every morning. He doesn't have to. He still brings up the moon to light our lights. He still allows electricity to go. We are certainly learning how that can just end in a second. Hail can just rain down on us at any minute and smash open our windows. We're learning that water tornadoes can just easily rip across our land. We're learning, 8 billion locusts came into 100 billion locusts descended on us just a few years ago. So it's just so easily everything can go wrong. And yet, even though we're cheating on him, even though we believe we're gods, even though we think we're the ones that actually determine our future, when really we're written in the stars, our future is written in the stars, and everything that we do, he already knew it and he wrote it in the stars. That's how great of a God he is. He's still, we cheat on him so much and he is still there for us. So who are we to say, well, we're just going to let you go because you totally sinned against me? None of us are morally pure. None of us are. And so read the book of Hosea. The book of Hosea outlines everything, the way the Lord views cheating and whether or not we're worthy to be married and how to handle someone if they're an adulteress, if your wife goes out and sleeps with other people, moves in with another man. Hosea, he was a prophet. The Lord had him marry a woman who was like the town prostitute, basically, something like that. She just made merry with everyone on the block. The Lord had him marry her and stay married to her, even when she left him and went, even though he's a prophet, she left him and went and lived with another man. She had parties, through all these parties, but when she got old enough, right? He traded her out for someone else and threw her on the street, and she ended up in the slave market. And no one bid on her. She'd been used up so much that no one bid on her. And the Lord had Hosea, even though the bidding was down to 3 pennies, the Lord had Hosea come in and offer 12 gold pieces and carry her out of there. That's exactly how the Lord loves us. And so don't say, oh, I was so good to her. I gave her 50%. I gave her the Benz and I gave her the house and the divorce. No, just because you want to marry some young chickie and you're going to go ahead and divorce her, just because you took care of her and threw a bunch of money at her, you still are putting your wife out on the market when she's, by heaven's standards, still married to you. So that's why I like that Jerry Weintraub story so much. In one of the first movies I recommended on Insider Movies, his wife had heard that he was sleeping with another girl in his office, and he went to her and she's like, I already know. He went to his own wife, and then he's like, I guess we'll have to get a divorce. And she's like, why get a divorce? Why get a divorce? And she didn't divorce him. They had worked and built an empire together, and she just let him, and then she brought the girl to all the parties. And I didn't know it at the time when I first saw that, but after reading all of this, I was like, she was obeying the natural law. Like, that's why I loved it so much, because she was gracious and she went with it, and she just didn't let it, kill her flow. She went out with a bang, and then, he died before her, didn't he? She's still partying on for years later. So just something to keep in mind, that Hosea is a great one, and to have grace, because we certainly don't deserve it. All right, where are we at? 36 minutes. I think that's a lot right there. I'm going to stop, and then I'm going to try and fill another one. But these are really, really big points that I really hope you can listen to over and over, that I get questions about all the time. I had questions about them forever. So it took a lot to research and find these out, and especially since sexual promiscuity and I would like to point, okay, I've been talking about the West a lot, so let's talk about, the East when it comes to this. So the Middle East, right, they say, oh, we marry our woman, they make their woman cover up, right? In Islam, in general, the women have to cover up their hair, because they call it, what do they call it? They have a name for it, not moral. There's some name for wearing modesty dress. That's right. Modesty clothing, modesty laws for the clothing. And it's don't show your hair. Don't let it come out the side of your head. Don't show your wrists. Don't show your ankles. And so on the outwards, it looks like Islam, and there's 53 nations of Islam where it's a state religion and where it's a majority religion. And they're it appears that they're extremely, extremely moral. They're extremely pure, because they make sure that the women do not sleep around. That's not allowed. They make sure that they marry their daughters off to someone who is also pure. They don't drink. They don't do drugs. They're extremely sober in the Middle East. These Islamic nations are extremely sober. They'll rent out their properties to you. The Maldives, that's an Islamic nation, but they don't allow you to buy land there unless you're a Muslim. You cannot buy land in the Maldives unless you're a Muslim. So all these travel things show these beautiful waters. There's a ton of shorts on YouTube. There's advertisements everywhere making the Maldives look like paradise. And yet, if you look into the Maldives, they've lost all their drinking water. And you would think, by everything that we're told, that the rich people are the ones who are supposed to suffer. And instead, it's the rich people houses where their resorts look great and fine. They're sitting on the water. Yes, the water's come up so high that, the rails, the steps that went into the sea are half covered in water now, in ocean water. But they still have these beautiful cabanas. They don't know what's happening on the main islands. They've lost a ton of their islands. They're underwater. But the sea, so much liquefaction has happened and so many earthquakes have happened that their drinking water, their underground drinking water, has all turned into salt water. So they don't have drinking water anymore. And you might ask, well, why aren't the beautiful cabanas and the beautiful resorts getting destroyed? Why are Muslims who are so pious and who aren't drinking and who aren't sleeping around, why are they the ones that are losing their drinking water? And I'm well, you got to look into Islam a bit more. Is that hospitable? Is that making peace when you say no one can buy unless you're a Muslim, when it's a state religion? It's that restrictive. Number two, if you leave Islam, you are killed. That's it. To to leave the faith. You're born into the faith, and then you have to be the faith. And if you don't, you're killed. Like, I was raised Catholic, and it was not good to leave the faith. Like, that's it. It's practically being excommunicated, right? But in Islam, you're killed. And there's a bunch of honor crimes that a woman can commit. Like, they say this thing about men, that men are like a piece of gold. If they do something immoral, it's like dipping them in poo, that they did a moral failure. But men can be washed off and they can be gold again, but not women. Women are like fine silk. And if they're dipped into, do a moral failure, if they're dipped into the poo, they can't be clean again. They're tarred forever. They don't come from the standpoint of everyone's sinful and you can't earn your way into heaven. They come from a point of, men are more pure, women are worth less. They go to the extremes when it comes to Eve and watching out for women. But then on the flip side of all of that, then they also marry the men who are supposed to be so morally pure. They can marry their kids. They can marry children as young as 6 years old. They can womanly. There's this whole thing on Islam, but remember also that concubines are legal in Islam. So yes, they have all these things about keeping our women all pure. Isn't that ironic that they cover their women head to toe? But then, when realtors are trying to sell to the Middle East and to Islamic nations and sheiks and oil barons, then what they do is they have these women who are mostly naked with chains all over and they're painted in gold. And you're like, well, how is that supposed to sell to the Middle East? And it's like, oh, right, concubines, sex slaves. That's actually legal. Slavery isn't illegal in Islam. It's actually taught. And before you go off about, that's a whole other thing. I was going to go into Judaism and Islam. That's a whole other thing. So, because of the stuff going on in the Middle East right now. So I'll leave that alone for now. But my point is that even those who appear to be morally pure, if you dig in a little bit more, that's actually not what's happening at all. So just keep that in mind. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and sign off. I love you guys so much, and I'll try to tape the next one right away because I know you want more, and I'm just going to try and push it and get more done for you. But anyway, if you could, please below, my medical treatment, the thing that allows me to speak like this, is extremely expensive. I am not a shareholder on the movies at all. They have a licensing agreement because of my first book, the Book of Katherine and the Chinese Maze. And so I get a very, very small, very, very small sliver of each movie ticket. And so, I still don't have with all the movies that have been out, my medical bills are still not paid. I'm like, how is this possible? I don't want to know the total, but it's not easy to take someone who cannot use their body and suddenly get them walking and talking again. That is extremely expensive, and usually people just end up dying, like with the illnesses that I have without a diagnosis and without the right clinic. And so I definitely, my doctors are very grateful for every progress I made because I came so close to death so often. So I'm very grateful for it. But if you could, down below, if you want to, it's totally up to you. And there are no amounts. Any amount is a blessing for me. But there's a link below that you can donate to my PayPal account. But it's totally up to you. You guys know, everybody, that's totally your call. I don't keep track. There are no lists. I just feel blessed because you guys are taking care of me as I try to take care of you, and I love our relationship. And thank you guys so much for doing this with me. I'm so grateful for it. All right, I'll talk to you guys later, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.